It started with the sound of the helicopter's rotors slicing through the air, a constant reminder that this was real. The weight of my gear pressed down on me as we descended, the quarantine wall looming like a grotesque monument to mankind's failure. We were being dropped off at the edge of a nightmare, an unnamed city that had become synonymous with horror. I felt the familiar tension settle in my gut, the same feeling that had gripped me before every mission. But this time, it was different. This time, we weren't just fighting an enemy. We were walking into a place where humanity itself had turned against us. Captain Blake's voice crackled through the comms, sharp and authoritative, as he briefed us one final time. "We're here to extract Dr. Aldridge and retrieve his research. Nothing else matters. Stay focused, stick to the plan, and we get out of here alive." His words were met with silence. We all knew the stakes. The infection that had ravaged this city was unlike anything we'd ever seen. It wasn't just a disease. It was a curse that turned people into something worse than animals. And now we were being sent into the belly of the beast to pull out one man and a few vials of God knows what. As we touched down, the reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. The city was dead. Not just empty dead. Buildings stood like skeletons, hollowed out and abandoned, their windows shattered like the eyes of corpses. The ground was littered with debris, and here and there, the remnants of what had once been people. Mutilated bodies lay in the streets, twisted and broken, as if the city itself had chewed them up and spat them out. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We moved quickly, Captain Blake leading the way with the rest of us following close behind. "Harper, stay close." That was the one rule that mattered now. I kept my eyes forward, but it was impossible to ignore the carnage around us. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister, every corner a potential death trap. My rifle felt like a lifeline, but I knew it wouldn't be enough if things went sideways. I caught Mason's eye as we advanced. His expression was grim, mirroring my own thoughts. We all knew this wasn't going to be a clean extraction. Our first encounter with the infected was as horrifying as I had feared. We turned a corner, and there they were, 3 of them, hunched over a body, tearing into it with a viciousness that was hard to comprehend. They looked up at us, their eyes wide and wild, and for a moment, I thought they might have been human after all. But then they moved, and that illusion shattered. They were fast, faster than any of us had anticipated, and it was all we could do to bring them down before they were on us. The gunfire echoed through the streets, a harsh reminder of how exposed we were. As the last one fell, a silence descended again, more suffocating than before. Carter was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. What the hell were those things? They looked like they knew we were coming. Captain Blake didn't answer right away. His gaze swept over the fallen infected, his jaw tight. "They're not human anymore. Don't forget that. We keep moving." But I saw the doubt flicker in his eyes, the same doubt I was feeling. These things weren't just mindless monsters. They were hunting us, and they were learning. We pressed on, but the unease only grew. The city felt like a maze, every street leading us deeper into its twisted heart. As we approached a rundown school, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The building was an ominous silhouette against the darkening sky, its windows like black holes staring back at us. We needed shelter, and this was as good as we were going to get. Inside, the school was a nightmare of its own. The walls were smeared with blood, the floors scattered with overturned desks and broken glass. It was clear that a desperate struggle had taken place here, and that no one had won. We moved through the corridors, the silence broken only by the creak of our boots on the floor and the distant, unsettling sounds from outside. The darkness was almost complete, and our flashlights cast long, eerie shadows that danced on the walls. Every step felt like it could be our last. Every door we opened a potential death sentence. We reached what had once been the gym, its vast space now a tomb of shattered dreams. The sight was enough to stop us in our tracks. A pile of bodies, all twisted together, some still clutching each other in death. The reality of our situation hit home once more. There was no safety here, no refuge from the nightmare that had consumed this city. As we set up a temporary base in the gym, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my mind. Mason must have felt it too, because he stayed close, his eyes darting around the room, never resting on one spot for too long. We were all on edge, the fear gnawing at our resolve like a persistent infection. Captain Blake ordered us to rest, but sleep was out of the question. Not here, not now. I kept my rifle close, ready for whatever was coming next. But deep down, I knew that nothing could prepare us for the horrors that lay ahead. And then, just as we were beginning to think we might make it through the night, we heard it, a noise from the corridor outside. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustling of fabric or the scrape of a shoe on the floor. It was enough to send a chill down my spine, and I knew that the nightmare was far from over. We were not alone. The infected were close, and they were waiting. We didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The sounds in the corridor kept us on edge, a constant reminder that we were surrounded by death, and death was always moving. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the broken windows, felt like a prelude to the horrors that could burst through the doors at any moment. Captain Blake kept his watchful eyes on us, his expression a mask of grim determination. I could tell he was already thinking several steps ahead, planning our next move, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. He was hiding something, and whatever it was, it gnawed at me like a splinter under my skin. As dawn broke, casting a sickly gray light through the dust-covered windows, we packed up what little we had and prepared to move out. The school, once a place of learning and laughter, was now nothing more than a tomb. The bodies in the gym, those twisted, broken forms, were a stark reminder of what awaited us if we failed. We moved quickly, silently, our footsteps muffled by the debris-strewn floors. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in our fearful glances and the tight grips on our weapons. We made our way deeper into the city, the streets narrowing into a labyrinth of destruction and decay. The farther we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the city itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Captain Blake led the way, his eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. I could see the tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were set, as if he were bracing for an impact that hadn't yet come. I found myself wondering again what he wasn't telling us, what orders he had received that went beyond the official mission briefing. It wasn't long before we reached our destination, the pharmaceutical company where Dr. Aldridge was supposed to be holed up. The building was a stark contrast to the chaos around it, its facade surprisingly intact, though dark and foreboding. We approached with caution, every nerve on edge. The entrance was barricaded from the inside, a clear sign that someone, or something, didn't want to be disturbed. Captain Blake gave the signal, and we moved in to breach. The doors gave way with a groan, and we slipped inside, weapons at the ready. The interior of the building was even worse than the outside. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay, and the walls were covered in streaks of dried blood. It was clear that whatever had happened here had been violent and swift. We moved through the dimly lit corridors, our footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. I could feel the tension mounting with every step, a knot tightening in my chest. Something about this place felt wrong, like we were walking into a trap, but there was no turning back now. We found Dr. Aldridge in a lab on the third floor, huddled in the corner like a wounded animal. His clothes were torn, his face pale and gaunt, and his eyes wide with fear. He looked up at us as we entered, and I saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze, followed by a wave of relief. But there was something else there too, something darker. Captain Blake approached him, his voice steady and commanding. "Dr. Aldridge, we're here to get you out. You need to come with us now." But the doctor didn't move. He just stared at us, his eyes flicking between Blake and the rest of the team. "What did they tell you?" Dr. Aldridge's voice was barely more than a whisper, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Blake didn't answer right away. He just stared at the doctor, his jaw clenched. "The mission is to retrieve you and your research. That's all we need to know." But Aldridge shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "That's not the whole truth, Captain. You know that, don't you? They're not sending you in here to save anyone. They're sending you in to cover their tracks. They want the infection, alive. They want to use it." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I glanced at Mason, seeing the same shock and anger reflected in his eyes. This wasn't what we signed up for. We weren't here to save lives. We were here to help the government weaponize the infection, to turn this horror into something even worse. Captain Blake didn't flinch. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. He had known. He had known all along, and he hadn't told us. The betrayal was like a knife in my back, and for the first time, I questioned everything about this mission. "Harper, stick to the plan." That's what I had always told myself, but now the plan felt like a lie. My thoughts were racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell were we supposed to do now? Follow orders and become accomplices to this madness, or do something, anything, to stop it? I could see the doubt spreading through the team, the cracks forming in our resolve. We had come here to fight monsters, but the real monsters were the ones who sent us here, the ones who were willing to unleash this horror on the world for their own gain. Captain Blake finally spoke, his voice cold and hard. "This mission isn't up for debate. We're getting the doctor and the samples out. That's the job." But as he said it, I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the crack in his facade. He knew as well as we did that this was wrong, but he was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. That's the way it had always been. But not this time. Not for me. I looked at Mason, and I could see the decision forming in his mind, the same one that was forming in mine. We couldn't do this. We couldn't let this happen. As we prepared to move out, the tension between us was palpable. Blake was still in charge, but his grip on the team was slipping. The truth had shattered the illusion of our mission, and now we were just a group of scared, angry soldiers, trying to figure out how to survive in a nightmare of our own making. I knew we couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give, and when it did, everything would change. We weren't just fighting for our lives anymore. We were fighting for our souls. We moved like shadows through the corridors of the pharmaceutical company, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. The air was thick with tension, every footstep echoing ominously in the silence. Captain Blake led the way, his back straight, his grip on his rifle iron-tight. But I could sense the uncertainty in him now, like a crack spreading through solid rock. He knew we were no longer just a team of soldiers following orders. We were something else now, something dangerous and unpredictable. The truth had shattered our unity, and the fragments were sharp enough to cut. As we descended into the bowels of the facility, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The stairwell was narrow, claustrophobic, each step taking us deeper into the darkness. The walls, once pristine white, were now stained with the signs of the chaos that had unfolded here. Blood, bullet holes, and deep gouges where someone, or something, had clawed at the concrete. It felt like we were descending into the heart of the infection itself, and in a way we were. This place was where it had all begun, where the experiments had unleashed something that should never have seen the light of day. At the bottom, we emerged into a vast underground chamber, the air thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. The lab stretched out before us, a maze of metal and glass, with rows of containment units lining the walls. Some were empty, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. Others were still sealed, but the things inside them thrashed against the glass, their twisted forms a mockery of life. This was where the infection had been born, where men in white coats had played God and created monsters. And now, we were here to clean up their mess, or die trying. Captain Blake's voice was low and tense as he gave the order. Plant the charges. We're blowing this place to hell. There was no argument this time. Even Blake knew there was no saving this facility, no salvaging the mission. We were past that now. The only thing left to do was destroy it, to make sure that whatever horrors had been unleashed here never saw the light of day again. Mason and I moved quickly, working together in grim silence as we set the explosives. Each beeping light felt like a countdown to our own deaths. But there was no other way. We had to finish this, even if it meant we didn't make it out alive. Just as we were finishing up, I heard the sound of footsteps behind us. Quick, sharp, too familiar to be anything but trouble. I turned, my rifle ready, and saw Captain Blake standing there, his face a mask of cold determination. But it wasn't just the look in his eyes that set off alarms in my head. It was the way he held his weapon. The barrel pointed just a little too casually in our direction. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. Blake wasn't going to let us walk away from this. He was here to make sure the mission was completed, one way or another. Step away from the charges, Blake ordered, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. We're taking the samples with us. We're not leaving empty-handed. I could feel the tension snap like a live wire, electrifying the air between us. Mason shot me a glance, his eyes full of the same disbelief and fury that were boiling up inside me. Blake was still trying to follow orders, still trying to complete a mission that should never have been started. He was willing to kill us to make sure those samples got out, even if it meant unleashing the infection on the rest of the world. I shook my head, my hands tightening on my rifle. You're out of your mind, Blake. This ends here. We're not letting you take those samples. The words came out more forcefully than I intended, but I didn't care. I was done playing soldier, done following orders that led to nothing but death and destruction. Blake's eyes narrowed, and I knew we were out of time. The situation had escalated beyond control, and there was no turning back. The fight was brutal, quick, and ugly. Blake was a trained killer, and he knew how to use every advantage. But Mason and I had something he didn't: resolve. We were fighting not just for our lives, but for the lives of everyone outside these walls, everyone who would be at risk if Blake succeeded. The sound of gunfire echoed through the chamber, a deafening roar that mixed with the high-pitched beeping of the charges counting down. The infected in the containment units thrashed wildly, their howls adding to the cacophony. In the end, it was Mason who delivered the final blow, a single shot that took Blake down. The captain crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that he had lost. But there was no time to reflect, no time to mourn the man who had once led us. The explosives were set, and the clock was ticking down faster than we could think. I grabbed Mason's arm, pulling him towards the exit, our only thought to get out before the whole place went up in flames. We sprinted through the corridors, the walls shaking as the charges began to detonate behind us. The sound was like a thunderstorm inside the building, each explosion sending shockwaves that rattled my bones. The air was thick with dust and smoke, choking us as we ran. The infected were loose now, free from their cages, and they came at us from all sides, their screams blending with the roar of the explosions. We fired wildly, desperately, knowing that every second counted. It was a race against death, and the odds weren't in our favor. Finally, we burst out of the facility, the cool night air hitting us like a slap. We didn't stop running until we were clear of the building, just in time to see it implode, the ground shaking beneath us as the lab collapsed into itself. Flames shot up into the sky, a fiery exclamation mark on the end of the nightmare. We stood there, panting, covered in sweat and grime, watching the destruction we had wrought. The infection was buried now, the lab and everything in it reduced to rubble. But the victory felt hollow, the cost too high. As we stood there, catching our breath, I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. We had stopped the infection from getting out, for now. But the truth was, we hadn't won. Not really. The infection had taken more than just the lives of our comrades. It had taken our souls, twisted us into something we didn't recognize. And as I looked at Mason, I could see that he felt it too. We had survived, but we weren't the same men who had entered that city. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure we ever would be again. The fire from the collapsed lab cast a glow over the night, its flickering light the only source of warmth in the cold, desolate city. Mason and I stood there, watching the flames dance as the last remnants of the pharmaceutical company crumbled into ashes. The weight of what we had done pressed down on us, heavier than the gear we carried. We had survived the mission, but it didn't feel like a victory. The infection was buried, but so were the lives we had once known, the men we had once been. And as I stood there, staring into the fire, I felt a coldness creeping through my veins, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Mason was the first to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. We did it. We stopped them. But even as he said it, there was no triumph in his words, no relief. He knew as well as I did that this was just the beginning of a new kind of nightmare. The infection might be contained here, in this city, but the cost had been unimaginable. We had lost more than just our comrades. We had lost our sense of purpose, our belief in the mission, and maybe even our humanity. I wanted to say something to him, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. As we turned away from the burning wreckage, the weight of our next steps loomed over us like a dark cloud. We had to get out of the city, had to make it back to the extraction point, but the path ahead was fraught with danger, and we were both running on fumes. Every step felt like an eternity, the streets stretching out before us like an endless maze. The city was eerily quiet now. The only sounds our labored breathing and the occasional distant crash of something falling in the ruins behind us. The infected had gone silent, but we knew they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake. As we walked, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at me. My body ached from the fight, from the tension of being on high alert for so long. But it was more than just physical exhaustion. There was a sickness inside me, something dark and insidious that I couldn't shake. I tried to push it aside, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but the feeling only grew stronger. It was like a weight in my chest, pressing down harder with every breath, every heartbeat. I didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to think about what it might mean, but deep down I knew. The infection wasn't just behind us, it was inside me. I glanced at Mason, wondering if he could see the change in me, if he could tell that something was wrong. But his eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face a mask of grim determination. We had been through too much together, and I didn't want to burden him with the truth. Not yet. Not when we were so close to getting out of this hellhole. But the thought gnawed at me, a constant whisper in the back of my mind. How much time did I have? How long before the infection took hold and turned me into one of those things? I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let it happen. The closer we got to the edge of the city, the heavier the silence became. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm, thick with tension and dread. We reached an intersection, and Mason paused, looking both ways as if trying to decide which direction to take. That's when I noticed it, the radio on his belt, crackling to life with a burst of static. We both froze, listening as a voice came through, faint but clear enough to make out the words. All units, be advised. New outbreaks reported in sectors 5, 7, and 10. Repeat, new outbreaks reported. All available units to respond immediately. The blood drained from my face as the reality of the situation hit me like a freight train. New outbreaks. How could that be? We had destroyed the lab, wiped out the source of the infection. But the voice on the radio didn't lie. The infection was spreading again, faster than we could have imagined. It didn't matter what we had done, didn't matter how many infected we had killed, or how many buildings we had blown up. The infection was out, and it was moving beyond the quarantine zone. The world outside was about to face the same nightmare we had just barely survived. Mason looked at me, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "Harper, what do we do now?" His voice was shaky, and I could see the cracks in his composure starting to show. He was looking to me for answers, but I had none to give. I felt the weight of my own sickness pressing down on me, the infection spreading through my body like wildfire. I was a ticking time bomb, and I knew it, but I couldn't let Mason see that. I had to keep him focused, had to get him out of here before it was too late, for both of us. "We keep moving," I said, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "We get to the extraction point and get the hell out of this city. We warn them, tell them what's coming. That's all we can do now." It was a hollow plan, but it was all I had. Mason nodded, his face pale but resolute. We set off again, our pace quickening as the sense of urgency grew. The world outside needed to know what was happening here, needed to be ready for the onslaught that was coming. And I needed to get Mason out before the infection took me. The journey to the extraction point was a blur of pain and exhaustion, every step a battle against the sickness that was eating me alive. I could feel it in every part of me now, a fire burning in my veins, clouding my thoughts, making it harder to focus. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while Mason was still depending on me. We finally reached the outskirts of the city, the massive quarantine wall looming ahead like a barrier between us and the rest of the world. Beyond it lay our escape, but for me, it was also a barrier I couldn't cross. I knew that now. I couldn't risk bringing the infection with me, couldn't risk infecting the people on the other side. I stopped short, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and Mason turned to look at me. Confusion and concern etched on his face. "Harper, what are you doing? We're almost there." I shook my head, the pain in my chest nearly unbearable now. "Mason, I can't go with you." The words felt like shards of glass in my throat, but they had to be said. "I'm infected. I've been infected since the lab. You have to go without me. You have to warn them." Mason's face twisted in horror, and for a moment, he looked like he was about to argue, to protest. But then he saw the truth in my eyes, saw the reality of what I was telling him. His shoulders slumped, and he took a step back, his hands trembling. "Harper, I'm sorry. I didn't know." I forced a smile, though it felt like my face might crack under the strain. "It's okay. Just get out of here. Tell them everything. Stop this before it spreads any further." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine for some last shred of hope, but there was none to give. Finally, he nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "I'll make sure they know. I'll make sure they stop it." With one last, pained look, he turned and ran towards the extraction point, leaving me alone in the shadow of the quarantine wall. I watched him go, the last of my strength draining away as I sank to the ground, my back against the cold concrete. The fire inside me was raging now, consuming everything in its path. I had done all I could, fought as hard as I could, but in the end, the infection had won. As I sat there, waiting for the end, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been for nothing. If the infection was already out there, spreading beyond the quarantine zone, then maybe we had lost the war before it had even begun. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me was the distant sound of helicopter blades, cutting through the air, carrying Mason to safety. I closed my eyes, knowing that my fight was over, but hoping, praying, that the world outside would be ready for what was coming next.